On January 5, 1942, with victory celebrations ringing out in Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's Imperial Combined Fleet, ordered preparations for the next stage of the Pacific War. The swift victories in the Philippines, Malaya, and Southeast Asia had given the Japanese military confidence. But Yamamoto, ever cautious, urged his staff to complete their plans by mid-February. As Japan quickly gained control over the Western Pacific, disagreements broke out among military leaders in Tokyo, while some nationalists pushed to keep expanding. Yamamoto, who had been opposed to war with the United States and Britain, feared the long-term consequences. He knew the victories couldn't last forever. Yamamoto's views were controversial, and he took refuge at sea aboard the Yamato, fearing assassination for his open criticism of Japan's political leadership. He believed Japan needed a quick and decisive victory, followed by peace talks. His skepticism grew as Japan's rapid expansion began to slow. The fall of Singapore was expected months away, but Yamamoto knew that once it happened, the British would likely seek peace. He had seen how, after the London naval conferences in the 1930s, the British and Americans responded to diplomatic pressures. By January, Japan seemed poised for total victory. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor, and British forces in the Pacific had been decimated. Despite this, Yamamoto's strategic goal was not just military success, but ensuring Japan could negotiate a peace deal before the inevitable counterattack came. Yamamoto's plan to expand further included a proposed attack on the Soviet Union, but the army vetoed it, citing the already strained commitments in China and Southeast Asia. His next suggestion was a campaign in the Indian Ocean to eliminate the British Far Eastern Fleet, then to link up with the Germans in the Middle East to secure oil. However, this too was rejected. Only two plans remained: one to attack Australia, depriving the U.S. of a key base, and another to press forward in the Solomon Islands. Yamamoto, unconvinced by the Australia plan's long-term prospects, looked to the more immediate, spectacular victory that would solidify Japan's position in the Pacific. But the attack on Pearl Harbor had not completely neutralized the U.S. Navy, as its carriers, though at sea, were untouched. Yamamoto's eyes turned to Midway Island, where a decisive battle could tip the balance in Japan's favor. In February, he ordered the creation of the ME Plan, aiming to destroy the American carrier force at Midway. At the same time, he sent another plan to Tokyo, outlining an invasion of North America via Alaska, hoping to extend Japan's reach. As Japan prepared for the Midway operation, the shock of the Doolittle Raid in April 1942 brought a sobering realization. The Americans were just beginning to fight. The raid had struck Tokyo and shaken Japanese morale, proving that the U.S. would not back down. Yamamoto, ever the realist, understood that Japan could not sustain its rapid military expansion indefinitely. The Midway operation, however, ended in disaster for Japan, as it lost 4 aircraft carriers in a single battle. This defeat shifted the momentum in favor of the Allies, and the dream of a quick victory crumbled. Though the Japanese continued to fight fiercely in the Pacific, Yamamoto's fears came to fruition. The Doolittle Raid marked a turning point, confirming that the U.S. was committed to the war. The Japanese were forced to reconsider their strategies as the war dragged on, marking the beginning of a slow but inevitable shift in the tide of battle. By early 1942, the threat of Japanese expansion in the Pacific was undeniable. General Douglas MacArthur warned the Australian government that they needed to prepare for a potential Japanese assault in the south, well before the expected push toward India. At the same time, MacArthur's request for additional carriers and planes was met with limitations. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, informed General George Marshall that the U.S. Pacific Fleet would only have 2 operational carriers until June, while the Japanese had 10. As the planning for Midway began, U.S. Pacific Fleet Commander Chester W. Nimitz had already anticipated the Japanese move, which would culminate in the Battle of Midway. Meanwhile, the Japanese military was solidifying its positions in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Major General Tomaro Hori's South Seas Force had landed in Salawa, and the Navy was building up an air base in Lae. Despite the looming defeat at Midway, Imperial General Headquarters pressed on with plans for further expansion, hoping to execute a grand strategy that would secure victory in the South Pacific. MacArthur, in response to the Japanese buildup, suggested a preemptive strike against New Britain and New Ireland, followed by an assault on Rabaul, Japan's main naval and air base in the area. His plan called for 2 carriers, 1,000 planes, and an amphibious division to push back the Japanese. However, Admiral King opposed MacArthur's plan, concerned that it would place too much responsibility on him and expose the carriers to land-based threats. Instead, King proposed a plan for a more defensive strategy, focused on protecting Australia and containing Japanese advances in the Pacific. The Joint Chiefs of Staff ultimately agreed with King's approach, but MacArthur was not pleased. King's plan involved a phased operation, with the first stage focused on taking the Santa Cruz Islands, followed by further operations in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, while MacArthur would take over after the initial stages. King had already planned the defense line to protect Australia. By late July, 177,000 Marines were being moved to the Pacific, preparing for what would be the first major Allied offensive against Japan. As the invasion plans were underway, Admiral Robert L. Gormley was sent to head the South Pacific Command. But as he began his preparations, he grew increasingly concerned about the lack of coordination and resources available for the operation. Despite his worries, the invasion would proceed, and Gormley soon realized the challenges of mounting such a large-scale operation with inadequate support. The logistical failures of intelligence, the lack of proper equipment, and the hurried pace of the mission marked the early stages of what would become a brutal and prolonged conflict. Amid these challenges, intelligence reports began to emerge, suggesting that the Japanese were preparing an airfield on Guadalcanal. In response, U.S. forces began to prepare for an amphibious invasion, which would eventually lead to the Battle of Guadalcanal. Yet, the invasion was marred by significant intelligence oversight and communication failures, which left the American forces vulnerable to a counterattack. The operation was plagued by the lack of clear search plans and insufficient air coverage, and the Japanese quickly moved to reinforce their positions. Despite these setbacks, the U.S. troops managed to land at Guadalcanal, achieving surprise and initial success. However, the Japanese resistance, including snipers and entrenched positions, turned the battle into a grueling conflict. The fighting intensified over the coming days, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The U.S. Marines, despite being outnumbered and facing strong opposition, began to dig in, pushing forward with tenacity to secure their foothold in the Pacific. The battle for Guadalcanal would mark a turning point in the Pacific War, signaling the beginning of a long and costly struggle for both sides. War Diaries Unveiled. A turning point in the Pacific. As tensions mounted in early 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japan's naval strategy, faced internal conflicts that shaped the direction of the Pacific War. Following the initial successes of the Pearl Harbor attack, Yamamoto knew Japan's position was precarious. He had long opposed the idea of a protracted war with the United States, knowing that Japan could not sustain a lengthy conflict against the Western powers. His concern was that the Japanese military's aggressive expansion would provoke a counterattack before they had secured a definitive victory. Yamamoto's reluctance to engage in an unlimited war with the United States and Britain was met with opposition within the military ranks. Hardline nationalists, who favored an all-out offensive, were eager to press on after early victories, including the destruction of American battleships at Pearl Harbor. They believed that Japan could push deeper into Southeast Asia and solidify its dominance in the Pacific. But Yamamoto remained cautious, understanding that the momentum Japan had gained was not sustainable without securing a peace settlement in the near future. As the Japanese forces advanced toward key strategic locations, Yamamoto's primary concern was how to deliver a decisive blow to the United States Navy. The Imperial General Staff had ambitious plans for the next phase of the war, with some suggesting an attack on the Soviet Union, others pushing for an invasion of Australia, and yet others proposing operations in the Indian Ocean. Yamamoto rejected the notion of fighting the Soviets, citing the overwhelming logistical and geographical challenges. Instead, he advocated for a bold strike into the Indian Ocean to cripple the British Eastern Fleet, which would sever vital oil supplies, and to potentially link up with the Germans pushing into the Soviet Union. Despite his reservations, Yamamoto found himself at odds with his own military. The army opposed his plan to move toward the Indian Ocean, preferring a more direct path toward Australia. Yamamoto also disliked the prospect of engaging in long-term campaigns that risked exhausting Japan's resources and manpower. Yet, the plans pressed on, with the debate continuing to simmer within Japan's military circles. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy, under the leadership of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, was preparing for the inevitable Japanese counteraction. In mid-1942, as the U.S. shifted its focus toward the pivotal Midway Island, Yamamoto's strategic concerns deepened. He knew that the key to victory was the destruction of America's Pacific Fleet, particularly its aircraft carriers, which had escaped destruction during the attack on Pearl Harbor. While Yamamoto's battle plans focused on a quick, devastating strike, the reality of war began to catch up with him. The Doolittle Raid on Tokyo in April 1940 sent shockwaves through Japan's leadership, signaling that the Americans were not defeated. This marked a turning point in the Pacific conflict. Yamamoto understood that Japan's victories would be short-lived if they did not secure a swift and overwhelming victory. The Battle of Midway, which Yamamoto had meticulously planned to destroy the remaining American fleet, became a decisive turning point, one that would end in disaster for Japan. For aircraft carriers were lost, and with them, the hope of Japanese naval dominance in the Pacific. As the battle raged, Yamamoto's worst fears were realized. Japan was unprepared for a long, drawn-out conflict. His vision of a quick, decisive victory and subsequent peace negotiations evaporated. In the wake of Midway, the tide of the war turned. Japan's internal debates over its strategy continued. But with each passing day, the realization set in Japan could no longer afford to fight the Western powers in an unlimited war. War Diaries Unveiled. The Battle for Guadalcanal. In the early days of the Pacific War, Tokyo had reveled in its victories, fueling the belief that Japan was invincible. This perception was actively encouraged by the Imperial High Command. But as the war progressed, the tides were beginning to shift. The Battle for Guadalcanal would mark the first major test of Japan's dominance in the Pacific. On the morning of August 7, 1942, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher called a meeting aboard his flagship, the USS Saratoga. It was the first time tactical commanders gathered to discuss the upcoming invasion of Guadalcanal. Fletcher was tasked with providing air cover for the invasion, while Admiral Turner would deliver the troops. However, the operation had been rushed, leaving no provisions for reserve troops. As they strategized, it became clear that the invasion was built on fragile assumptions. Fletcher, hesitant to risk the carriers, proposed offering only 2 days of air support before withdrawing. His reluctance was a product of his earlier experiences, notably at the Battle of Coral Sea, where hesitation had cost precious resources. Admiral Turner, who understood the broader strategic picture better than anyone, pushed back. He argued that the stakes were too high to back down, stressing that they had no choice but to risk everything. The men aboard the Saratoga could sense the tension, Fletcher's reluctance clashing with Turner's determination. Despite this conflict, the invasion proceeded. On July 28, a rehearsal on Kororo Island near Fiji was a failure, with only 1/3 of the assigned troops managing to land and execute the operation correctly. There was no time for second-guessing. The forces were heading for Guadalcanal, with the goal to seize key airfields and stop the Japanese advance. As the American invasion fleet steamed toward Guadalcanal, the Japanese were preoccupied with their own operations, while the Japanese army focused on securing New Guinea. Their air power remained concentrated on defending against Allied air raids in the region. Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, the Yamato, was anchored far from the action, preparing for future operations over Australia. However, as the Japanese forces failed to detect the American buildup, they were caught by surprise when American carriers launched a strike on Guadalcanal on the morning of August 7. The surprise was total. American planes destroyed the Japanese seaplanes on Gavatu and Tana Mbio Go Islands before the enemy could even respond. The Americans had planned their attack to perfection, but as they moved inland, they soon discovered the viciousness of Japanese resistance. The Japanese, entrenched in well-fortified positions, fought back with brutal tenacity. The Marines were forced to climb steep ridges and clear dugouts with explosives. Snipers hid in trees, targeting American forces with deadly precision. The battle on Guadalcanal would not be easy. The Japanese were known for their ferocious defense, and their commitment to fight until the end was evident. Even when outnumbered and surrounded, they did not surrender. This suicidal resistance shocked the Marines, who faced opposition not only from entrenched soldiers, but from the very landscape itself. As they moved through thick jungle and dense underbrush, each advance came with high casualties. Despite this, they pushed forward, driven by their mission to secure the island. By August 8, the Marines had established a foothold on Guadalcanal. Yet the battle was far from over. Japanese forces on the island continued to fight back, launching desperate counterattacks through the night. But as each day passed, the American forces gained more ground. Despite the fierce resistance, the Japanese were on the defensive, unable to repel the Americans as they secured vital positions on the island. In the days following the landing, the American forces continued to clear out Japanese positions, but the full scale of the challenge became clear. The brutal fighting at Guadalcanal marked a turning point. The Japanese, who had once believed they were invincible, now found themselves on the back foot, their momentum stalling as the Allies took control of the Pacific theater. This pivotal battle was the first of many to come, but it was clear that the war was far from over. The lessons learned here of resilience, strategy, and sacrifice would resonate throughout the Pacific campaign, forever changing the course of history. War Diaries Unveiled. The Battle for Guadalcanal. In the wake of Japan's victories, the belief in its invincibility was strong, a sentiment echoed throughout the Imperial High Command. Yet, as Japan's aggressive expansion continued, internal conflicts were bubbling beneath the surface. Admiral Yamamoto, despite his tactical brilliance, feared the limits of Japan's reach and the consequences of a prolonged, unlimited war with the West. The battle for Guadalcanal began on August 7, 1942. When Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher called his first meeting aboard the USS Saratoga, gathering the tactical unit commanders to discuss the invasion. Fletcher, nervous about the risk to his carriers, was hesitant to offer full support for more than 2 days. Admiral Turner, leading the ground forces, disagreed, pushing for a full commitment. This marked the growing tension between the two men, Fletcher as caution and Turner as drive to win at all costs. The rehearsal on Kororo Island in Fiji had shown that only 1/3 of the troops managed to land successfully, with little understanding of how to proceed once ashore. With no time to reconsider, the invasion fleet continued toward Guadalcanal. On August 7, the skies cleared as the invasion fleet neared the island, and the American carrier planes launched their first strike. The surprise was total. The Japanese seaplanes stationed at Gavatu and Tanembio Islands were destroyed before they could even react. As American forces moved inland, they faced fierce resistance from the entrenched Japanese forces. The Japanese had dug in, setting up defensive positions along the ridge lines. The Marines, led by Colonel Edson, struggled through dense jungle, enduring heavy casualties. The Japanese fought tenaciously, employing snipers and suicide tactics to delay the American advance. These desperate counterattacks were not new to the Marines, but the fierce resistance on Guadalcanal was unlike anything they had faced. By August 8, the Marines had secured the island's main objectives, but the battle raged on. The Japanese, outnumbered and with no hope of reinforcements, fought to the death. This attitude, though familiar to the Americans by now, was still unsettling. The Marines encountered numerous examples of soldiers choosing death over surrender, their suicides serving as a testament to the Japanese Army's grim resolve. As the battle continued, it became evident that the Americans were making slow but steady progress. Yet, the fighting was far from over. The Marines faced entrenched Japanese troops who refused to retreat, despite their dire circumstances. Each Japanese position had to be taken one by one. The battle for Guadalcanal revealed the true nature of the Japanese defense: organized, disciplined, and relentless. Meanwhile, at the Japanese command level, Admiral Yamamoto's strategic concerns were growing. His belief in the necessity of a quick and decisive victory was clear. He had warned against the dangers of overextension and the risks of continuing the war indefinitely. The war in the Pacific, though initially promising, was showing signs of wear. Yamamoto's fears were compounded by Japan's shifting focus plans for future operations in the Soviet Union, Australia, and the Indian Ocean continued to divide military leaders. Yet, as the battle for Guadalcanal unfolded, it became clear that the tides of war were beginning to turn. Japan's military might, though formidable, was no longer enough to secure victory. As the Americans secured Guadalcanal, they set their sights on the next phase of the war, with the realization that this battle would define the course of the Pacific conflict. War Diaries Unveiled. The Battle for Guadalcanal. Admiral G.H. Maawa, commander of the Japanese 8th Fleet and the Outer South Seas Force, immediately responded to the American invasion of Guadalcanal. His first move was to send 6 small transport ships with 2,000 troops to reinforce the island's garrison. But the convoy ran into the American submarine S-38, operating out of Australia. The submarine sank the Mao Maru, taking 342 men with it. With this blow, coupled with reports of a vast American invasion fleet, Maawa decided it was too risky to send additional forces at that moment, ordering the remaining 5 transports to return. The Japanese command, however, was not sitting idle. Early on August 7, the Choi, a heavy cruiser, set out for Rabaul, accompanied by 2 light cruisers and a destroyer. Maawa soon redirected all 5 cruisers to Rabaul, where he would strategize his next move. He planned a surprise night attack on the American beachhead, knowing that while the Americans had carriers, they lacked proficiency in night operations, a domain where the Japanese excelled. The plan was to delay their arrival until after midnight on August 8, attacking when the Americans least expected it. As Maawa's ships moved south, the U.S. intelligence community, relying on air searches and submarine reports, had only limited information, while the S-38 had reported a sighting of the Japanese force. This information was largely ignored, as Rabaul was a well-known base for the Japanese Navy. As a result, the U.S. Navy remained unaware of the impending threat. Meanwhile, Admiral Turner, leading the American amphibious operation, was concerned about the vulnerability of the invasion fleet. He had noticed a gap in the U.S. search coverage, particularly over the narrow strait between Guadalcanal and Florida Island. Despite recognizing the risk, the fleet proceeded with its preparations, and on August 8, a series of air reconnaissance flights were launched. Though, crucially, the slot was left uncovered. This oversight would prove to be a critical flaw. The Japanese forces, under Maawa, prepared for a battle they expected to win. By the time the American air reconnaissance teams launched their search, the Japanese had already moved into position. The first encounter between the Japanese and American forces occurred as the Japanese launched their first wave of bombers and fighters, facing off against the American F-4F Wildcats. The initial attack by the Americans was successful, downing most of the enemy bombers. But the Japanese Zeros, still superior in skill and maneuverability, proved to be a formidable threat. On the ground, the Marines on Guadalcanal faced fierce resistance. As the Japanese made their way down the slot, they encountered heavy artillery fire and bombing raids, leading to substantial casualties on both sides. Meanwhile, at Rabaul, Admiral Maawa and his forces were already preparing for their next strike, anticipating a larger American response. For Yamamoto, the strategic situation was becoming increasingly dire. His initial hopes of a swift, overwhelming victory in the Pacific were fading, and internal conflicts within the Japanese command were intensifying. The debate over future military targets, whether to focus on the Soviet Union, the Indian Ocean, or Australia, highlighted the divisions within the leadership. Yamamoto, who had consistently warned against waging an unlimited war, faced growing pressure from militaristic factions eager to expand Japan's dominance. As the battle for Guadalcanal unfolded, Yamamoto's concerns became more evident. The Japanese military's underestimation of American resilience and the overconfidence that had fueled their initial successes were now threatening to unravel their progress. With each passing day, the tide of war seemed to be shifting, and the uncertainty of Japan's future in the Pacific became all the more apparent. The critical decisions made in the coming weeks would ultimately define the course of the Pacific War.